Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. Thanks for watching another video on History of Leaders of Thought. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Today we will be doing Niccolo Machiavelli and Francis Bacon. So in specific regards to Machiavelli, I'm pretty excited about doing this video. Obviously I've covered a lot of lives previously, but Machiavelli was the first book on philosophy that I ever actually picked up. It was very accessible because The Prince specifically is very, very short. It's dense, but it's very short. If you're a fast reader, you could probably read it in a day. Similarly, I also had a copy of Discourses attached on the back as well, so I had the opportunity to read his two most famous writings right at the onset of my fascination in both philosophy and politics and all that. So holds a special place in my life. But once again, obviously, he's known for Machiavellianism, which is a derogatory term for the concept of immoral actions to achieve certain objectives. So we can discuss, or you can kind of come up with an opinion in your own head whether or not you think was a better force generally or a negative force on society. My thoughts are that I think firstly he was slightly more in the positive direction, but either way he was an inevitable force. So I think whether or not he existed, his ideas would have come to fruition either way. So in some ways he's a messenger, and yeah. So I guess to kind of get into a brief overview, and then we'll go into detail into his actual life. So he was born in 1469, and he died in 1527. This is obviously AD, in Florence, Italy. He's known as a diplomat, politician, historian, philosopher, writer, but less known in modernity as a playwright and poet. So he actually wrote comedies and carnival songs and poems and such, and actually within his own lifetime he was more famous for his artistic achievements such as his plays than he actually was for something such as The Prince, because that was written to the Lorenzo de' Medici specifically, and Discourses, which obviously came later in his life. So whereas today we hardly know about any of his plays, whereas they did get a little resurgence in the 1980s, he's pretty much known just as a philosopher. So with that, he's considered the father of modern political philosophy and political science. So that is obviously a huge title to give to one. He held various roles under the Florentine Republic, and he was ultimately sort of cast aside when the Medicis took power over Florence again. So yeah, I guess we'll go into his actual specific life. So as mentioned earlier, he was born in Florence, Italy. He was the third child to Bernardo di Machiavelli and Bartolomea di Stefano Nelli. So that was his father and mother, respectively. He was their third child. However, he was the first male, so that obviously brought him back up in terms of the hierarchy, because back then male children were just generally treated better. So he was fortunate in that, even though he was the third, he was still the first male. Supposedly the Machiavellis on his father's side descended from the Marquis of Tuscany, so he has some royal blood, or blood that had roles in the government. Supposedly 13 of his ancestors served as justices in Florence. So these justices were pretty much one of justice or signoria. There were essentially 9 people who formed the government, and so supposedly he had some powerful roots. But despite this, and despite his family's legacy in Florence and his own influences in Florence, he actually never receives Florentine citizenship. During his life, there were a lot of wars between the city-states in Italy, largely caused, these were often proxy wars headed by the Pope or France or Spain or even regional governments there. So he was witnessing a lot of this at a young age and throughout his whole life, and this is obviously which had a huge influence on his own political and philosophical ideas. Similarly, during this time, there were a lot of mercenary armies who would sort of change leadership just at a moment's notice to the right payer, and this obviously became a big cornerstone in his philosophy, where he advocates for not using mercenaries to have a more cohesive and successful army. In terms of education, he studied grammar and rhetoric, but he supposedly did not ever learn Greek. He spoke Latin, of course, but this may seem like, oh, well, not too surprising, but supposedly at the time in Florence, most well-educated people would have the means and access to learn Greek, so it's surprising, especially considering he does have a passion for the classics, most likely heavily influenced by those such as Xenophon, but supposedly he never learned Greek. So in 1494, Florence turns into a republic. So the Medici family had been ruling Florence for over 60 years, but they were overthrown and the republic came into power. So there's also this other individual named Savonarola who was ultimately executed. He was one who was advocating for a popular republic in Florence, which was obviously something that would have aligned with Machiavelli's beliefs. His later beliefs were more aligns with that which he writes in the Discourses. However, he refused to join the Pope's Holy League, so they condemned him and hanged him. He was a priest, so essentially this pro-republican individual or pro-popular government individual was hanged and killed by the Pope, and Machiavelli got to take his position. So then becomes second chancery, which is a more powerful office, and it was a writing office. So he was essentially in charge of production of government documents. So this is he obviously probably learned how to write a lot in his education, but this probably refined it, and also gave him the outlets for sharing some of his ideas and starting to formulate his own philosophies. He took many diplomatic missions, notably to the papacy in Rome, and he did notice during this time the brutality of Caesarea Borgia. So Caesarea Borgia, or the Borgia, were very cruel leaders at the time. So Caesar Borgia was actually the son of Pope Alexander the Sixth, and they had this sort of state-building practice where they would essentially take control over city-states using the church and the Pope as justification, but really they were just sort of brutal conquerors. He also took missions to the court of Louis XII and to the Spanish court, so he was very well traveled, which I think is, as I said before, it's not a sufficient condition to be a great, well-learned person, but it is a necessary condition. So by that I mean, just because you have traveled a lot wouldn't make you a well-learned person, but if you haven't traveled, then I would say that it's sort of necessary. In 1503, he gets the role in charge of the Florentine militia. So he has quite a bit of success here with his philosophy that they're going to focus more on citizen armies as opposed to mercenary armies. So his most famous success was the defeating Pisa in 1509, and generally he got quite a bit of success here. So proving that, I think this is most important in that if he had no practical experience, I don't think his writings would have carried as much weight as potentially truthful or as eloquent his writing style might have been if he did not have his own sort of military successes and political successes under his belt. I doubt it would have been very well read or well received. In 1512, the Medicis get support from Pope Julius II, and using Spanish troops, once again mercenary troops, they defeat the Florentine Republic and take control over the state again. Piero Soderini, who was in charge of the Republic in the time period between that, supposedly he was unwilling to compromise with the Medicis and the papacy, so eventually he had to resign and was exiled. So there's a little bit of dispute here whether it was, to what extent it was this individual's fault, or to what extent it was just the malice or greed of the Medicis. I tend to side with the belief that the Medicis were the ones who were sort of ultimately caused it. I think if the Republic had a different leader, I think maybe given a certain amount of time, the Medicis would have wanted to take over Florence once again, especially under the right Pope, which Pope Julius II proved to be. So during this time, he lost his job because he was accused of having a conspiracy against the Medicis, and he was even tortured with the rope, which is where they hang an individual by their wrists and it like dislodges your shoulders. It's kind of like, I don't know, a stretching technique. You're probably familiar with a stretcher where they just stretch your body on a horizontal plane, but this is using gravity and the wrists. But he was tortured, but throughout the whole experience, he denied ever having a conspiracy against the Medicis. So, what is true? Did he conspire against the Medicis? Perhaps. But by the end, he didn't hold a grudge against the Medicis. In fact, he ends up writing his most famous work to the Medicis, and it seems like the whole rest of his life, whether he did the act or did not do the act, he was trying to get their forgiveness. So, I think at least post-action, he had no mens rea. So with this, he retires to his estate in Percusina, which is near Florence, and he sort of dedicates the rest of his life to writing and study. He feared getting too much political involvement, so he involves himself in some intellectual groups, which by that they mean like play groups, and this is where he does a lot of his playwriting and poetry and those sort of achievements, which actually achieved moderate success, were sufficient to pay his bills, even though during this time he was living much in rags, whether from choice or not, but he achieved decent success in the artistic sphere. But he was still more passionate with politics, and I think this can be outlined in this following quote. So he wrote this quote to Francesco Vittori. So Francesco Vittori was a friend of his who served for the Republic at the time, but then he had switched over to the Medici government to support them. So he was not convicted of conspiracy, so maybe that's evidence that Machiavelli in fact was, but hard to say. Either way, he writes the following letter to his friend. When evening comes, I go back home and go to my study. On the threshold, I take off my work clothes, covered in mud and filth, and I put on clothes of an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing, and I was born to savor. I am not ashamed to talk to them and ask them to explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling anxiety. I forget every worry. I am no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I live entirely through them. So I think this is an absolutely beautiful quote for multiple reasons. Firstly, I think it gives I'll break down the whole quote. Firstly, he comes in rags, so that's kind of giving a little bit of character background into what his life was like at this point. He was either just outright poor, or he was living a sort of ascetic life, so he sort of chose to live in rags. But when he came home, he sort of dressed up and he lived the part. This might be sort of an exaggeration, but the point was he took his reading and studying very seriously. He also says, I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. So he finds studying this history or studying this philosophy to be more nourishing than food, and he thought it was his own destiny to be studying this. So he thought he was born to be doing this. He says, I'm not ashamed to talk to them and explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. So that, I think, is the beauty of reading. So, for example, they say, and I mentioned this before, you're an abstraction of the 5 people you spend the most time with, but you can, For example, if you spend 20% of your day reading Machiavelli, it's like you know Machiavelli, and he will never say no to you because it's a book. They will never refuse you. So that is also another point there. And then 4 hours go by without my feeling anxiety. So I think there's a sort of an anxiety epidemic we're experiencing in society. I think a lot of it is just because people are not passionate about what they're doing. So in this example, most people, if they were to sit down for 4 hours, they would get anxiety unless they're really passionate about something. So twofold, I think it touches on a current issue that we're still trying to solve, but it also emphasizes his passion for history. And he forgets every worry, and I'm no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. And then lastly, I live entirely through them. So I think that is a nice and well put sentence. So when you read, and as I present this, I don't want you to read with them. I want you to read through them. I want you to feel like you're a Machiavelli, not feel like you know Machiavelli, feel like you are Machiavelli, because he will become a part of you. So just an absolutely beautiful quote. And with that, he sort of writes his famous Prince, which he addresses to Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, sort of just giving him an outline, but also asking for a job. He ultimately dies in 1527. He gets his last rites received, so he does his proper religious processes, and he's buried at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. On his epitaph, I think there's a very nice quote, and here's a little image of the oh, sorry, it's cut off. Apologies. Here's a little image of his epitaph, but it reads, Tanto nomini nullum par elogium. So this can be translated to, so great a name has no adequate praise, or no eulogy would match for such a great name. So tanto nomini nullum, so no name there for elogium. So I think that's just a beautiful epitaph. And so I guess to get into his actual philosophies, that's his life. So he gets a lot of criticism because there's not a lot of coherence. For example, the Prince and Discourses, the Prince is specifically doesn't even advocate for principality. It's specifically an instruction book of how to run a principality or how to run a monarchy. And whereas his Discourses sort of advocates for, not only describes different types of governments such as a democracy or an aristocracy, but it also sort of advocates for some of the positive features of some of the others. So they say he might lack coherence, but I don't think so personally. So that's my stance on that. I think he understood all different types of government, and he pretty much wrote as was necessary to please his current government, but also to please his own beliefs. In terms of his influences, I think it's important to note, and it also, if you've been following along with this video series, will help explain a lot of things. So Xenophon and Isocrates, so they're categorized in what is called a mirror of princes, which is kind of like a directive or self-help sort of books. So these two individuals wrote these books called Mirror of Princes to instruct their leaders at the time, and that's exactly what Machiavelli did. So he followed Aristotle, both styles of Aristotle, so original Aristotelianism, but also the more modernized Thomas Aquinas, which had the Catholic influences. But for his raw Aristotelianism, it's probably closest to maybe Averroism, because Averroism is trying to revive original Aristotelianism. So I have videos on all of these individuals. In terms of the materialists, he followed Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, and but he's considered sort of almost one step above the materialists in that he also included Socratic political life. So he wasn't just a materialist, but he was also, well, I guess it would be vice versa. He was firstly a philosopher, but he was also followed materialism. Lastly, Thucydides, who wrote History of the Peloponnesian War, who I also covered, an extremely important piece of work. It's considered one of the first pieces of history that's actually not like pseudo-history. Like, for example, the history of Troy is so clouded in myth that it's really hard to determine what exactly it is. But Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is pretty accurate, and he actually draws specific examples in his writing. So evidently he must have read him. And I also have a video on him as well. in terms of empiricism, and realism versus idealism. He always took in the very opening chapters of The Prince, he advocates for almost a very scientific approach, and throughout the whole book whereas a lot of previous philosophers would just sort of give their point straight to the point, he draws from explicit examples, which is the concept of empiricism, which is using data, and that later gets really helps has a huge influence on Francis Bacon, who's the founder of the scientific method, which is derived from empiricism. He thought that data and history had to be extensively studied, and it's the only way of approaching conclusions in terms of politics and philosophy. But he thought specifically foundings of cities is really the key, the foundation, because the foundation has a ripple effect. So, for example, if you want to learn about Rome, a really good place to start would be Romulus and Remus, and Numa Pompilius, who is the second. But to start at the foundation would really add a lot of clarity to, for example, I think that's explicit. In terms of idealism, he thought that virtuous living did not necessarily equal happiness, which was a common classical belief at the time. And more specifically, he thought that misery, as I have the quote here, is one of the vices that enables a prince to rule. So misery has a necessary function in society, both in that people have misery, otherwise, how is the prince ever going to invoke fear on you if you don't have misery? But also, I think maybe less explicit is that the prince should also have the capacity for miseries, because something's got to guide his judgment as well. Here's another quote, sort of getting more into the idealism. It would be best to be both loved and feared, but since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. So this is probably the most quoted Machiavelli quote, and probably what he's most known for. And it is, it's been paraphrased many times, but basically it is more useful to be feared than it is to be loved. I think this is actually and he draws explicit examples, but I don't think this is something that's always true. So Machiavelli's The Prince was really one of the first real instructive books on politics since The Art of War, but I think a lot of these issues are that they can often be one-sided. I think in some cases it is better to be loved than feared. Another example is that he says, a prince who has great difficulty in attaining their principality will have ease in maintaining it, whereas a prince who has ease in gaining their principality will have difficulty in maintaining it. So this is obviously true. Well, it obviously can be true, and obviously it sounds very nice. It's got some parallelism in terms of structure. It sounds right, but it's not necessarily true. I think a principality that's hard to attain can also be hard to maintain as well. So just because it sounds right doesn't always mean it's correct. And same thing applies here. I think in some cases, depending on the state, it could be better to be loved than to be feared. But I do think he is right in the majority of cases. With fear, you can execute a bit more authority. In terms of his thoughts on fortune, so Christianity and teleological Aristotelianism taught that teaching greed and ambition is sort of a bad thing, and Machiavelli sort of noted that at this time, the Christianity was kind of making people lazy or kind of killing their ambition, and he thought that virtue and providence can give one a better future, whereas just relying solely on fortune or relying solely on religion cannot actually determine one's future. Like one of the top finance individuals that I follow always said that you make your own luck. Essentially, that's essentially the quote, and that's I think what he's alluding to. He also sort of changed people's outlook on. It used to be we talked a little bit about just war, and that war is only just if it's for the preservation of the state or for protective measures. He sort of brought a different philosophy that it's not just about the preservation of the state, it's about the optimization of the state, and this could involve change of design but also risk taking. So that sort of really, that's why he was obviously in the Renaissance, but these were useful ideas to start thinking of coming towards the Enlightenment, where they were willing to completely throw governments on them or flip governments upside down and whatnot, which is, I think, a necessary trait. And I think even maybe today people have gotten a little bit too complacent in that. Would the people have the strength to join up if they wanted to change government? It's hard to say, and it's obviously speculation, but it was a change in mindset that he brought about here. He said that war and ambition and spiritedness were part of human nature. So he thought that Strauss, who was a very famous philosopher we'll be speaking of soon, said that this sort of explains why the arms race was inevitable. But his concept of all these things being part of human nature, as previous philosophers have said, human nature or nature is the result of God. So Machiavelli never makes the connection here, but for example, if there is a God and our nature is the cause of God, why do we have such ambition? And that could be a cool theological proof to that. In terms of religion, he thought that religion was man-made, so moving a huge step back from a lot of our, especially particularly the most recent video, which is Thomas Aquinas and Averroes. He mentioned pagan and Christian patriarchs interchangeably. So he referred to, at one point, the prophets. He says Theseus, Moses, and Romulus. So he puts, Theseus and Moses right next to each other in terms of prophets. He thought that all of these people were essentially just founders of communities or founders of religions, and on average, he hypothesized that they last 1,666 to 3,000 years. So he does not explicitly say it, but he in some ways anticipates an end of Christianity. Obviously, it didn't come as he anticipated, but he thought that was sort of an inevitable thing. He saw that religion is necessary in a republic. So however, in a monarchy or principality, religion is not needed. So hypothetically, the prince already has absolute control. Maybe it's through divine right, or maybe it's just through some other means. However, if you have a republic and no one has absolute control, religion is necessary, and that's what he presupposes. And this belief sort of lasted all the way up until the French Revolution, where ultimately they believed that church and state there should be more separation, and the Enlightenment, a very common Enlightenment belief. Some of the positives to come out of his beliefs, particularly in the discourses, he praises the plebeian court and the Roman Senate in Rome. So he saw merit in the division of powers, and this obviously had huge effects going forward. John Adams in the United States pulled upon Machiavelli as a reference here in terms of division of powers, and we can see that today in the United States, and we also have it in Canada, and even in the UK as well, upper house and lower house in Canada, House of Commons and the Senate, so a plebeian court and whatnot. He is also seen as a way to justify capitalism. So, for example, capitalism can be defined as public virtue from private vice. So, in some ways, for example, just having greed and ambition might actually be a vice, but it is better for the state, and the state should, to some extent, incentivize this. So, ultimately, the book The Prince received somewhat mixed reception. The Catholic Church at one time banned it. There's his plays got sort of lost popularity, but today he's considered one of the top and forefront, at least most important philosophical and political thinkers of all time. Personally, I think Discourses might be the greatest piece of political writing that I've read. So, to kind of, I guess, elaborate on the two, well, I'll go through the quotes and then I'll elaborate on my perspectives on the two. So, the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. So that's kind of also, like I was saying before, the abstraction of the 5 people you're with. Because the people around them, firstly, assuming that the ruler, they chose them, and secondly, they also influence him. So it could be bad choice on his part, but also bad influences. So obviously a good metric. So in The Prince, he explicitly outlines that, well, various ways that the prince should optimize their state. For example, don't use mercenaries. For example, if they capture a state that already has freedom, they said it's better to just destroy the state, because eventually they're going to fight for freedom again. So obviously some very, very harsh beliefs, but for those who actually are willing to continue reading and read into the Discourses, he actually advocates for the importance of all different types of governments, and he realizes that all of them have flaws. So to paraphrase one of the passages, he says that all monarchies eventually fall into tyrannies. So eventually a king is going to get bad and tyrannical. All aristocracies eventually fall into oligarchies, and all democracies all fall into tyrannies. So eventually all governments collapse anyways. He doesn't really push for one being better than the other, but one thing he does advocate for is that a bigger state, it could make more sense to have a more centralized government. So for example, if you're a small tribe, community, it's fine to have a complete socialist policy. You share all the food and everything, but as things get bigger, you need to have a stronger, more central government. And I think that does hold merit, and I think it's generally true. As communities get bigger, central government gets bigger and bigger. But he also saw that it was a sort of a cycle too. There's naturally a progression to a consolidation of power. So even with a democracy, some people are going to be pushing a little bit harder and trying to be getting a little bit more power, and eventually moving towards an aristocracy. And with an aristocracy, as alluded to in an earlier video, the one aristocrat will always want to have more power. You cannot ever curb that ambition, and that's why Hobbes said just stay at monarchy, so that, because any oligarchy or any aristocracy, there's going to be the fact that they're all there, they all want to have more power, so eventually it will fall into a monarchy. But then eventually all monarchies get tyrannical, collapses, falls back into anarchy again. So that's sort of what he believed there, and very beautiful. It's a very beautiful way, at least for me. It was very nice because it was the first book on political philosophy that I read, and it really gave me a full scope of the government structures and how they can be formed, and the benefits, and just a holistic view. And I thought it was really brilliant. So I'm going to finish this. I mentioned this quote actually in the history of ancient Greek and Roman history, but it's one of my favorite quotes of all time, and it's influenced my own life, so I'll read it to you. Among all men who have been praised, the most lauded are those who are heads and establishers of religions. Next after them are those who have founded republics and kingdoms. After these are celebrated those who have commanded armies, and who have enlarged the territory of their kingdom and those in their country. To these should be added men of letters, and because these are of many fields, they are celebrated according to their degree of excellence. To other men, the number of whom is infinite, some degree of praise is given to them as pertain to their art or profession. So when I first read this is in Discourses, it was really useful for me, because I wasn't really sure how I wanted to direct my life. I was considering, obviously, perhaps running for public office, or perhaps staying for a private organization or something like that. So I'll break it down. Basically, I guess to start with the bottom, he says that those people who have a certain art or profession, they are ultimately infinite in number. So if you are in some kind of private sector, you can have some degree of praise. You might be the best. I don't want to particularly attack any profession, but let's say I don't know, a carpenter. You build chairs. You might be the best chair builder in the world, but there are infinite number of chairs builders, so it's not very important. Obviously, it's sad, but this has kind of guided my life. So to those are men of letters, and because there are many fields, are celebrated according to their degree of excellence. So this is like generals and people, but ultimately they're subordinates of those who command armies and enlarge the territory of their kingdom and those in their country. So this is where we start to get to people who make it to the history books. This is like Patton, or this is like, I don't know, certain generals, famous generals. Obviously, that is a more risky career, but it is more, I would say, quote unquote, glorious than some profession or art. Above that, it is those who have founded republics and kingdoms. So that is obviously a very important thing, but not just because of the power it'll achieve for you. It's, I think, the concept of creating kingdoms and republics is to unite people. Humans used to be in hundreds of thousands of different tribes, but now we're in less than 200 countries, so our tribes have gotten a lot bigger but fewer. So, and then next is religion. So this is also an amalgamating feature. There are basically, I don't know, the vast majority of people are divided in a very few amount of religions, and those can be thought of as big tribes, but they also, in terms of the history books, those who establish religions do fare the best. So either way, this has just kind of guided my life and kind of has invoked fear in me to live a life of mediocrity and sort of, yeah. So that is Machiavelli. We will get to more of him in the comparison after talking about Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon, first Viscount of St. Alban. He's a philosopher and was a philosopher and statesman, served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. He is most famous for developing the scientific method. So if you don't know the scientific method, well, obviously I'll explain it, but I'd be surprised if you didn't. Which obviously had almost an infinite amount of influence on science generally. He's famous for his method on cataloging books, where he divided into history, poetry, and philosophy, which obviously have been subcategorized. He went to Trinity College in Cambridge, which still exists today. However, he was studying a medieval curriculum in Latin, which you will not find today. He was the first recipient of the Queen Council designation in 1597 by Elizabeth I, who assigned him as legal advisor. James the Sixth knighted him, and he also got the title Baron. Verulam was created for him, and Viscount of St. Alban. But he had no heirs, so both of these titles are actually gone, because he ultimately dies of pneumonia while he was trying to preserve meats by freezing them, and he ultimately died from that. So, to talk about his life first, so early life, he was born in York House, which is in the Strand in London. His father was Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, so obviously a very powerful and important individual. And his mother was Anne Cook, whose father was Anthony Cook, who was a Renaissance humanitarian, or pretty much a famous thinker. So he had sort of both fascination in thinking, but also in terms of political endeavors. Growing up, he had poor health, so he was educated at home. However, just considering how powerful and wealthy his family was, he got the tutelage of John Walsall from Oxford, who sort of got him into Puritanism ideas, which is essentially bringing England more towards Protestantism and more Reformation. Following this, he goes to Trinity College in Cambridge at 12 years old, so obviously we wouldn't see that today, except an extraordinary circumstances, but back then 12 years old was not too young to begin an academic career. He went with his older brother, Anthony Bacon, who shares the same name as his mother's father. And while there, he gets the personal tutelage of Dr. John Whitgift. So he ultimately becomes the future Archbishop of Canterbury. So a good connection, so probably a very ambitious person, but also getting him more onto the Puritanism side or Protestantism side, because the Archbishop of Canterbury represented the English Church, which was sort of generally opposed to the Pope and the Vatican, and they were Protestants. He went to University of Poitiers in France, and he studied Latin and medieval curriculum. At Cambridge, he met Elizabeth I, who later ends up being a very important figure in his life. She was impressed, and she referred to him as the young Lord Keeper. So he joins a Societe Magistrorum at Gray's Inn. So that is, you have to join these 4 houses essentially to practice law in the UK, and he joined Gray's Inn. He had problem with a lot of people at the time saying that Aristotelian philosophy was not aligned with Aristotle, so he probably would have gotten along well with Averroes. He was following his education. He starts working with Sir Amias Paulet, who was the ambassador to France. So his older brother actually stayed back in England, but he got to travel extensively. So he went to France because the Amias Paulet was the ambassador. So Henry III was there. The French economy was doing very well, so he got great education. He was eating well. He was learning languages and a lot about statecraft. He also got to travel to Italy and Spain. So once again, similar to Machiavelli, not a sufficient requirement, but it is necessary to at least have traveled to many of the other states. I don't think if he wanted to speak a lot about politics, he would have had the right to do so if he hadn't visited the other states. Eventually, around this time, his father dies, and he was going to give a certain estate to Francis, but he died before that, so he only earned 1/5 of the total amount of money, and obviously it still was a certain sum, but at this time Francis Bacon starts accumulating huge amounts of debt. His mother gives him a little bit of income, but he realizes he needs to start working, and so he keeps working at Gray's Inn to sort of finance his growing debt accumulation. Before moving to his character, I'll just talk about this image here. This is a picture of him when he was young, and the quotes around it said, "If only one could paint his head," or something along those lines. So that's just, I don't know, I think it's interesting that he was already considered an intellectual when he was so young and being drawn at that time. So, and he got respect from the Queen, even though his family and fathers were successful. I think one good reference point would be that he went with the ambassador to France, but his older brother didn't. So usually it would be the older brother who's gifted with the better opportunities, but it seemed as though Francis Bacon was more inclined to have a successful career than his older brother, Anthony Bacon. So he wanted to join Parliament. He had pretty much 3 goals in his life. Firstly, uncover truth. Secondly, serve his country. And thirdly, serve his church. So pretty simple, and he realized that he needed an important role to accomplish these. So in 1580, he asks Lord Burghley, who was his uncle, to help him get a job at the court, but he was rejected. So why am I telling you this? I think firstly it's important just to give him a full picture, but it's important to note that even these famous people also fail a lot too. So 2 years later, he gets the role of outer barrister, which is essentially a lawyer, but not in the Queen's Council. 1581, he gets his first MP role. So for those of you who are not from a country that has members of parliament essentially represent certain constituents, sort of as they have in the US, kind of like a senator, elected individual. So he serves as MP for Bosny in Cornwall in a by-election in 1581. Following that, in 1584, he served as MP for Melcombe. 1586, Taunton, and during this time he actually openly urged for the execution of Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, Bloody Mary. So this was obviously, firstly and foremost, it was probably for political means. He probably wanted to get the favor of the Protestants, but secondly also he just grew up an Anglican and sort of anti-Catholicism, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was part of the Catholic faction, being Scottish. He starts writing on philosophical reform. He starts criticizing parties and churches, but none of his writings really get a lot of fame at this point, and he still never gets any significant roles. At this point, he asks his uncle again to help him, and this time he does, and he gets rapid progression in the bar, and he gets the role of a bencher and later a reader, so 2 very important legal roles. In 1588, served as MP for Liverpool. 1593 as Middlesex. He served 3 times for Ipswich and 1 time for Cambridge, so serving MP all over the place. I think partially because he was getting better and better constituencies, but I also think he was maybe one of the better MPs at getting work done, so he was sort of passed around as necessary. That's sort of my interpretation by the fact that he moved around so much. He's considered liberal-minded, and he was always eager to amend and simplify the law. He was very friendly to the crown, so his friend was Queen Elizabeth I, but he did oppose feudal privileges and dictatorial powers, so he did sort of want to restrict their... I think fundamentally he was sort of, I guess, not as pro-monarchy, but through necessity, because it was good for his career, he became very pro-monarchy. He also he was against religious persecution, so he thought that religious persecution and persecution should be 2 separate things, and he advocated for the union of England and Scotland, which was interesting because, he wanted Mary, Queen of Scots to be killed because, for various reasons, partly because she was Catholic, but ultimately he thought that the England and Scotland should be combined, as it is today in the United Kingdom. And later he also advocates for including Ireland as well. He thought, despite the differences, it would be better for peace generally, but also the strength of the 2 states, or the combined state. He reads this individual named Robert Persons, who is sort of an anti-government Jesuit priest, and he made this writing called Certain Observations Made Upon Libel, and basically Robert Persons was criticizing the monarch at the time for their treatment of the Spanish, but Francis uses this as an opportunity to twofold show his allegiance to the English monarch, but also his understanding of history. So he draws on Athens as an example and draws parallels between Athens and England as sort of the perfect state, and then criticizes Spain and therefore justifies England's doings. So at this point he fails to get Attorney General. This other individual ends up winning it, named Coke, who we'll end up discussing quite a bit in detail. He also even fails to get the lower role, Solicitor General. So one of the individuals who blocked him's name was Lord Essex. He gave him property instead, but I think this is an interesting characteristic of Bacon, because as soon as he got the estate that he was given instead of the role, he just sold off the estate. He wanted the job more than he wanted the money. So I don't think he was very financially inclined, because he was always running into debt, but I don't think it's because he wanted to make a lot of money. It's just that he wasn't interested in it. Eventually, Queen Elizabeth gives him the role of he becomes the first Queen's Counsel designate. So he also gets a patent to give him precedent at the bar. So at this point, a lot of the other lawyers or other MPs are starting to get critical of Bacon because he's getting too much favoritism from the monarch. but he was still not that, well, for that reason, he was not that popular. So what he tried doing was he tried marrying this wealthy widow to try to get him some more popularity amongst the general population. A girl named Elizabeth Hatton, who was only 20 at the time, much younger than he was, but instead she ends up marrying Edward Coke, the same individual who got the job that he wanted, the Attorney General job. So Edward Coke was richer, and throughout Bacon's life, Edward Coke is sort of like his rival. So, fortunately for this, he severs his ties with his rival Lord Essex, because Lord Essex was also the one who didn't give him the role originally, and there was an investigation led by Coke and ultimately and him as well, but Lord Essex was ultimately sentenced to death, and Bacon was one of the key, although Edward Coke was the leading lawyer on the case, he also worked on this as well. He participated by writing down most of the works at the request of the Queen, but he was also, it said that he was a very good lawyer and that he was free from malice. He was no defender of any man and no revenger of injuries. So he was actually very impartial in this regards. So he didn't just convict this individual because he didn't give him the job. He convicted him because he thought it was right. So, yeah. At this point, King James comes to the throne, and in 1603, he knights Francis Bacon. He, at this point, and I think this is very indicative of his character, though, he apologizes to the Lord of Essex for the case because King James supported Lord of Essex. So this shows now that Bacon is a bit of a political chameleon, and that he will dispense of his ideas in order to satisfy the crown. This time he marries this individual named Alice Burnham. Said she was much younger. She was only 14 at the time. He was 45, but he loved and respected her. Supposedly he gave her this robe and she wore it all the way till her death, and she died 20 years later. But then there's also an alternative perspective in that as he started to run out of money, run into debt, she had an affair with another individual. Another completely different concept is that a lot of people criticize Francis Bacon of homosexuality. He's got some writings where he writes on the beautiness of some younger individuals, but the same thing was also applied to the King James. So perhaps maybe Francis Bacon and King James were having some sort of affair. Perhaps they were, perhaps they weren't. It's hard to say. But another point is that this was a very common thing to be attributed to people, because it was also even attributed to his brother, so it could not be true. Maybe I'll pose it to you like this. I think the likelihood that all three of them were homosexual is very unlikely. The likelihood that one is probably likely, but who was it? I don't know. Probably of them all, Francis Bacon, and not the king and not his brother. But that's just my perspective. But he still loved this individual. At this point, he gets clerkship at the Star Chamber, which is one of the pretty much top legal jobs you can get. But he had a huge and hefty salary, but he still had too much debt. So I think this is more to do with negligence than an opulent lifestyle. I think obviously he was surrounded by the king, and he was pretty much the top, most powerful private citizen, but he shouldn't have needed to run into so much debt. He, kind of ironically, King James I gets criticized by the population for embarrassing extravagances, so it's Francis Bacon's job to tell James not to be spending so much, but I think that's kind of ironic because Francis Bacon, based on his debt, probably had a spending problem in his own right, but this did not cause any rift between the two. Gets Attorney General in 1613, and it was an individual named Edmund Peacham who was found with treason, and it was a very controversial case, but he used zealous effort in torture in terms of for the case. So those were obviously debatable things. I don't think torture is ever justified in terms of any sort of court hearing. So I think that was wrong, but maybe you might think torture might sometimes be justified. Yeah. No, I don't think torture is ever justified. In terms of law, so at this point he gets the title. It's called to create him. So he was created Baron Verulam. So his official title at this point was Francis Lord Verulam. And he was he kind of at this point was a mediator between the king and parliament, because he was very partial to the king but still trying to win the favor of parliament, so he did have a certain important purpose. And in 1621 he gets the title of Viscount St. Albans, which is the one he currently carries, or carried to his death. In 1621, because of his debt, he is found with 23 counts of corruption, and this charge is led by Sir Edward Coke, sort of his rival. But he said, "My lords, it is my act, my hand, and my heart. I beseech your lordships to be merciful to a broken reed." So I think he was just, I don't think it was very malicious. I think he was just very poor spender. I also think he grew up in a very wealthy lifestyle, but he didn't get the inheritance he was expecting, so he wasn't able to sustain that lifetime. Similarly, he was probably trying to keep up with his friends who had royal blood, which obviously put a strain on his wallet. The way he is charged with £40,000 and sent to the Tower of London, the King's decree, but he only serves 3 days in the Tower of London, and the King actually remits the fine. So obviously, whereas many others would have been killed, since he was friends with the King, he kind of got off easy there. But despite this, he was prevented from holding any more offices. He was almost what's called degradation, where he would have lost all of his titles, but he kept them, he retained them. So in terms of was he actually guilty of these 23 counts of corruption, it said that he received many gifts, which is obviously not okay, but the argument against it was that he said that it never affected his judgment. So I think it's like the act might have been wrong, but the intention was correct. Again, I think based on what I've read about him, I think he was impartial. And although receiving gifts would have been bad, it would have been hard for him to turn down gifts when he had so much debt. But I don't think it also had an impact on his ability to perform, so I don't think it was all too bad. But similar to Machiavelli, he spends the rest of his time sort of just writing, because he's now in retirement, and he ultimately dies when experimenting with the preservation of meat as he gets pneumonia. So in terms of some of his beliefs, in terms of religion, as I mentioned, he was an Anglican, so he thought that the philosophy and the natural world can be concluded through induction, which would be like the scientific method. But religion, he thought, was kind of a separate category, and only arguments could be analyzed, right? Because there's no form of induction, there's no scientific method for analyzing religion. So he was actually, rather than trying to address or trying to include science into religion, he just completely separated the two. He saw something called cumulative knowledge, where he thought essentially cumulative knowledge, but it also grows into religion. So there's a quote here. Well, here's part of it. "Knowledge is a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate." So knowledge essentially helps you get towards religion, and here's one that most clearly explains it. "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." So that's that sort of cumulative effect where it actually gets to religion. So obviously, despite him being the founder of the scientific method, he was not an atheist. There's what's called idola tribus fallacy, which is idols of the tribe, and he wrote a book on this. So he used Neptune as an example. So he thought, although he thought that religion would be one of the highest forms of learning, he thought that religions often had a fallacy of attributing things to false idols, and that's what he wrote about. So he saw that it can often blind individuals to the truths. So some of his works in terms of science, he wrote this book called Novum Organum, which is based on Organum by Aristotle, and obviously a huge piece of work on science, but also really clearly explains what the scientific method is. Voltaire himself said he's the father of the scientific method. So the scientific method, as I've already alluded to before, is essentially just using data, using empiricism, so collecting data, form a hypothesis, and then testing the hypothesis. That's essentially the scientific method. He also, in terms of other influences, so in terms of North America, many of the British colonies, particularly Virginia, the Carolinas, and Newfoundland, which is actually a eastern province in Canada, can attribute much of their formation to Francis Bacon, particularly on his book on Virginia. Thomas Jefferson has a quote here. This quote here, this is by Thomas Jefferson, not by Francis Bacon. Bacon, Locke, and Newton, I consider them the three greatest men that have ever lived, without exception, and as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in physical and moral sciences. So that's a really good one, because firstly, three greatest men that have ever lived. From Thomas Jefferson is easily one of my favorite American founding fathers. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he was extremely well read. He was the one who was, he said, "What would I be without my books?" If you see, unfortunately his library burned down, but they recreated it in Washington D.C. He was probably the most prolific reader of all the founding fathers, so he knew about all the individuals. And to put him first, well, maybe he put these three alphabetical, but either way, he makes it to the top three. That's really quite amazing, really quite profound. And also, so Locke is definitely just the moral sciences. Newton could be seen as the physical sciences, but Bacon, I think, is both the physical and moral sciences there. So in terms of law, he had a huge influence on the Napoleonic Code, which I plan to cover quite extensively. In terms of common law, so common law did already exist, but his formula were using cases where there is unwritten law to cover the gaps, determining the relevance of precedents with reason and logic, and treating opposing legal briefs as adversarial hypotheses, as applications of a new facts. So basically, just his approach to using common law was a lot more formulaic, very much parallel to his founding of the scientific method. I guess two last things. Firstly, there's I wouldn't even call it conspiracy, but some people have attributed some of Shakespeare's writings to Francis Bacon. You could read up on it. There's multiple theories behind it. I don't want to delve too much into it, because there's, as I said, I like to assume things are true, but I think to attribute Shakespeare to Bacon would be just as criminal as to say that Shakespeare wrote that which Francis Bacon wrote. I think it's nice to keep them separate. But if you'd like to believe it, I recommend reading up on it, because if that were true and he also wrote many of the works that Shakespeare did, that would make him not only the founder of the scientific method, but also the greatest poet, far beyond even Machiavelli, as we just mentioned. So that would be quite amazing. But I personally don't think it's true. And lastly, I'll finish with this quote here at the bottom. Hope is a good breakfast, but it is a bad supper. So the point here is that obviously hope is good. You should have hope in the morning, but by the time you get to supper, you should have accomplished it. And yeah, it's kind of harsh, but hope, if you still have hope at supper, it was probably empty. That's basically, you have to materialize it. You have to manifest it for it to actually exist. So that's Francis Bacon in terms of the comparison between the two. So they both sort of moved away from religion, especially comparing relative to their contemporaries and many of the other thinkers that we had been covering closer to this time period. They both sort of struggled in their careers as a result of the government. So the government, for Francis Bacon, it was more so on the popular government as opposed to the monarch, but Machiavelli was completely pulled from his position when the Medicis took their positions. And then another comparison here was that they actually proved as both chameleons in this regards. So Machiavelli, as soon as the Medicis took power, he switched up and said, "Oh, I love principalities," and completely changed his philosophy, when in fact I do think he was a Republican. But Francis Bacon, he was didn't like the Lord of Essex, then he tried the Lord of Essex, and then he pardoned him just to sort of please the monarch. So they were both political chameleons in that regard. Bacon was, well, Bacon explicitly credits Machiavelli to the using empiricism to come to conclusions. So despite Francis Bacon being known as the founder of the scientific method, he personally had attributed it to Machiavelli. So similar but different there in terms of comparison. I think Machiavelli was a bit less flamboyant. Like, as I said, he would live in later part of his life in rags, whereas Francis Bacon, even he was running into so much debt, obviously that means he's living beyond his own means. So that was something else there. So that's Machiavelli and that's Bacon. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Yeah, if you have anything you'd like to share with me about either of these two individuals, I love talking about them. I love thinking about them, because every time they pop into my head, it's like they manifest inside me. So it's really, really exciting for me. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you watch some of the ones I'll be making in the future and some of the ones that I've made in the past. Thanks so much. Bye.